Gonzaga earned a number 8 seed in the NCAA tournament, their lowest since 2016, and they'll take on the Georgia Bulldogs on Thursday as the NCAA tournament gets underway.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Monday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, the Zags got an 8 seed, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Was it too high? Was it too low? Was it just right? We're going to talk about their opponent, the Georgia Bulldogs. We're going to talk about how this is one of the lowest seeds Gonzaga's gotten in a long time. We're also going to take a look at the overall region for Gonzaga. Who else is on their side of the bracket? We'll, of course, talk about Houston, the potential matchup in the round of 32. And then we'll close out the show looking more at the bracket overall. We'll talk about where St. Mary's is, where BYU is, where some of Gonzaga's other opponents from earlier this season are. We'll talk about some of the new teams in the NCAA tournament, take a look at the Pac-12 conference and how that has shaken out in this year's NCAA tournament, all that to close out the show. We'll, of course, get more in depth into Gonzaga's matchup with Georgia later in the week. That game will be on Thursday, but that's where we want to start, obviously. Thursday, March 20th, 1:35 Pacific time is the scheduled tip-off, so it'll be one of the first games kind of in that second wave of games on Thursday, the first day of the full madness of the NCAA tournament after the play-in games are over. Again, the game will be on TBS, 1:35 p.m. Pacific time. It'll be in Wichita, first time playing in Wichita as a regional seed for Gonzaga in their history, so that's a new experience for them. The second round game for Gonzaga would, in theory, be against Houston, the number 1 seed, the third number 1 seed. The total number 1 seeds were Auburn, number 1 overall. Duke was number 2 overall. Houston, number 3. Florida, number 4. Those are your 4 1 seeds. Gonzaga potentially drawing Houston in the second round if they're able to get by Georgia, and if Houston is able to get by SIUE, the 16 seed in the region. This is Gonzaga's lowest seed since the 2015 season, which is when their Sweet 16 streak began, the 2015-16 season. That's when Gonzaga really struggled in conference play that year, ultimately got it together in time to win the WCC tournament, which they needed to do that year in order to keep their streak of making the NCAA tournament alive. Gonzaga able to win against St. Mary's in the WCC championship game thanks to Eric McClellan's 22 points. Domantas Sabonis then goes crazy in the NCAA tournament. They upset a 3-seeded Utah team in the round of 32, and that is actually where Gonzaga's current Sweet 16 streak began, was that season back when they were an 11 seed in 2015-16. This will be Gonzaga's third time being a number 8 seed. They were an 8 seed back in the 2013-14 season when they lost to Aaron Gordon and the number 1 seeded Arizona Wildcats in the round of 32. They were also a number 1 seed back in 2010 after the 2009-10 season when they also won their first game and lost in the second round to a number 1 seed, this time Wesley Johnson, Andy Routens, and Jim Boeheim's Syracuse Orange. I was a freshman that season when they lost to Syracuse. It was just after my senior year when they lost to Aaron Gordon and Arizona. So 2 seasons where I'm very familiar with Gonzaga, having watched them extensively throughout that season. And this year's Gonzaga team was better. This year's Gonzaga team was better than both those teams. Comparing across eras, comparing across seasons, certainly decades, in the case of both of these seasons is obviously doesn't really mean anything. An 8 seed in 2014 should not be compared to an 8 seed in 2025. That's not the point that I'm making. But if you watch this team, they were frustrating. We've never denied that here on Locked On Zags. But if you watch this team and you watch those 2 teams, I think you would reasonably come to the same conclusion that this year's team was better. And I do think that is leading to some of the conversation of, did Gonzaga get underseeded? Should they have been higher than an 8 seed? And we've talked a lot about Gonzaga's resume lately on Locked On Zags. We talked about the fact that they ended up 5-5 in quad 1 games. We talked about the fact that they were 5-2 in those quad 2 games, with those quad 2 losses being the losses to Santa Clara and to Oregon State, Oregon State being a road game, Santa Clara being a home game. I actually believe they were 5-3 in quad 2 games because they also lost that game to West Virginia, which for most of the season was a quad 1 loss, but ended up being a quad 2 loss as West Virginia stumbled down the stretch, stumbled far enough, frankly, to actually not even make the NCAA tournament. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. But Gonzaga's advanced metrics, their computer metrics, loved them. 8th in the net, 9th at Ken Pom, 10th at Torvik, three sites that, again, were used by the selection committee to make the evaluations for the NCAA tournament. Those specific metrics, I'm sure, played a factor, but were not ultimately determined to give Gonzaga much of a boost because ultimately the Zags didn't win the games they needed to win. Their wins above bubble metric wasn't very good. Their strength of schedule metric wasn't very good, which was unfortunate because that's not something they could really control. The fact that a lot of the teams Gonzaga played this year, like Baylor and San Diego State and Indiana and a few others, really didn't live up to expectations, and it's hard to control that if you're Gonzaga, but unfortunately that was a reality that they faced this year. But ultimately, Gonzaga did this to themselves. They didn't win the games they needed to win. They had a chance to beat Kentucky. I mean, not only a chance to beat Kentucky, they had an 18-point lead against Kentucky, and they blew it and lost. They beat UConn for 34 out of 40 minutes in that game against the Huskies, but they lost because they got outscored massively in the first 3 minutes of each of those two halves. They had every opportunity to beat UCLA and couldn't get it done. There was no excuse to lose to West Virginia in overtime, and there's no excuse to lose those games in conference play when they lost to Oregon State in the Gill Coliseum in Corvallis, and when they lost to Santa Clara, giving up 18 made threes, and then, of course, getting swept in the regular season by St. Mary's. I'm not saying Gonzaga needed to win all those games, but they needed to win half of them. At the very least, not take the ugly losses. But unfortunately, Gonzaga just didn't win enough games and lost enough close games. They were close. Every one of them was close. That's why Gonzaga was so favored by the computer metrics. But at the end of the day, the lack of quality wins was determined enough by the committee to put them on the 8 seed line as opposed to giving them a 7 or even a 6 seed, which is where many people had started to project the Zags. Not many on the 6. A lot of people had them on the 7 line, but ultimately the committee decided to give them an 8 seed. We'll talk briefly about Georgia. We're going to have a much more detailed conversation about the Bulldogs later in the week. One of 14 SEC teams in the NCAA tournament. 14, that is a record for any conference. The previous record was 11 by the Big East back in 2011. So this 3 more teams than any other conference has ever put in the NCAA tournament. 14 out of 16, 7/8 of the SEC is dancing this year. That is absolute insanity. Georgia went 8-10 in conference play, 20-12 overall. They're led by star freshman Asa Newell, who was a significant target for Gonzaga in the recruiting class, and for him and Zoom Diallo, who of course went to Washington, were the 2 big targets for Mark Few and the Zags. Newell decided to follow his family to Georgia as opposed to going elsewhere, and he's been great. 15 points, about 7 rebounds per game. He's a good shot blocker. He's a decent shooter. He's a really good rebounder, very good offensive rebounder in particular. Like I said, we'll have more about Georgia, Mike White's team, a little bit later this week, but just a quick primer on them. They're good. They played in the toughest conference, arguably of all time in college basketball. They have a star freshman who Gonzaga is familiar with in Asa Newell. Should be a very, very fun game. They're also both teams named G Bulldogs, so some fun similarities as these two teams get set to square off on Thursday afternoon Pacific time to see who will advance to potentially play the Houston Cougars in the round of 32. And that's what I want to talk about moving on. What does the rest of Gonzaga's region look like? And can a deep run happen? It's difficult to make a deep run from an 8 seed, but it is not impossible. We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, are you looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfast, and grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. I love how Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and without sacrificing taste. These meals are packed with flavor. The convenience is unbeatable. No prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege 50 off and use code LockedOnCollege 50 off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. Today's episode is also brought to you by Supply House. Get the supplies you need from the site made for the skilled trades, Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product information to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. If you need help with an order, Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage, so now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're still going through Gonzaga's draw in the 2025 NCAA Tournament, an 8 seed for the third time in program history, first time lining up in Wichita, and they will be facing the number 9 seeded Georgia Bulldogs. Like I said, we will talk more about Georgia and Asa Newell and this club later in the week, but for now, I want to take an overall look at the Midwest region where Gonzaga was slotted. We'll also talk to close out the show about some of Gonzaga's opponents this year. We'll talk about St. Mary's draw, some other fun facts about this bracket to close out the show. But first, let's talk about this Midwest region. So we mentioned, obviously, Gonzaga, Georgia, the 8-9. They're in the same little pod with the 1 seed and the 16 seed, the 1 seed being the Houston Cougars, 30-4 this year in the Big 12 for Kelvin Sampson's team. They were the third 1 seed, with Florida being the 4th 1 seed, ran through the Big 12 as they did last year, as they've done really, I mean, again, they've only been in the Big 12 for 2 years, but they've done it both their 2 seasons in the Big 12. They were doing it in the American Athletic Conference prior to coming over. Kelvin Sampson's done some phenomenal work with this Cougars program since he's been there. They are going to be a strong favorite to make it to the Final Four or the Elite 8 at least. Gonzaga's going to have their hands full if they end up making it to that matchup. This team is tough. They're physical. They're a great rebounding team. They have talented guards in Milos Uzan and LJ Cryer. They've had some injury issues recently. We'll see if that continues to be a problem for the Cougs, but not an easy matchup whatsoever. And that's, of course, if Gonzaga can get past that Georgia team as well. Further down in this bracket, the 5-12 matchup is Clemson-McNeese. We'll start with Clemson. Brad Brownell's team went to the Elite 8 last year, brought back a lot of the same faces. They lose P.J. Hall, but they bring back Ian Shefflin, the chef. Fantastic for him. Chase Hunter dealing with a hand injury right now, so that is something to keep an eye on for the Clemson Tigers. But Ian Shefflin's been fantastic. Jaden Zachary, big-time addition for them in the transfer portal out of Boston College. But they're going to have their hands full with the 12-seed McNeese, and obviously Gonzaga fans will be familiar with staring across from a 12-seeded McNeese team, as that's what happened last year, as the Zags earned that 5 seed, faced McNeese in the first round. Will Wade's team beat them quite handily in that game, and then, of course, went on to beat number 4-seeded Kansas, advanced to the Sweet 16. That was all last year. This year, Clemson's going to have their hands full with McNeese. They did the same thing they did last year. They won 30-plus games in the regular season, dominated the Southland Conference. Will Wade continuing to audition to get back to the Power 5 level after losing his job at LSU previously. This McNeese team is very good, but again, they are going to have their hands full with Clemson. The winner of that game will play the winner of the 4-13 matchup between Purdue and High Point. High Point, one of the new teams making the NCAA tournament for the very first time. That also includes SIU Edwardsville, who is Houston will play in that 1-16 game, so your 4-13 matchup. Also featuring a new team in High Point, taking on a very not new team, the NCAA tournament in Purdue, who is, of course, in the national championship game last year. Tons of success recently under Coach Matt Painter in particular because of big man Zach Edey. Edey's not there, though. Purdue still had a fantastic season. Really a ton of success from this team. Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer, dynamic backcourt. They're both juniors now after being the 2 lead guards for this team in the Zach Edey 2-year dominant era. Trey Kaufman-Wren, fantastic big for Purdue as well. Definitely a team to keep an eye on coming out of this region. Then down below, you get the 6-11 matchup, the 6-seed Illinois fighting Illini, another Big Ten team in this region, taking on the first bubble the bubble matchup in this bracket. 11 Texas versus 11 Xavier. They'll play in. Whoever wins that game will get a chance to take on Illinois. Was not surprised to see Texas on the correct side of the bubble. Again, the SEC dominant this year. Texas 7 quad 1 wins. Did well in the SEC tournament, beating 5-seeded Texas A&M. That was a huge win for Texas to put them on the correct side of the bubble. Trey Johnson, one of the best freshmen in the entire country. He is must-watch TV, and he's potentially, if they get past John Miller and Xavier, would face an Illinois team that has some of the best freshmen in the entire country as well, notably Kasparas, Jakucionis, who is a tremendous talent. Jakucionis and Trey Johnson, both likely lottery picks, potentially top 10 picks in the 2025 NBA draft. Again, if we get that matchup, very, very fun. But watch out for Xavier. They've played some good ball as of late. Took Marquette to a really close game after beating them on the road in the regular season. Team that could make some noise as well. Then we got another opponent Gonzaga has seen already this year. Kentucky, the 3-seeded Wildcats, taking on 14-seeded Troy. Kentucky dealing with injuries right now. Lamont Butler has been in and out of the lineup the last few weeks. Jackson Robinson out of the lineup as well. Kirk Kriisa has not played since Gonzaga's game against Kentucky way back in early December. So Mark Pope took over for a Kentucky team that didn't do very well last year, replaced the entire roster, played in the most competitive conference in college basketball history, lost his 2 starting point guards and his other starting guard in Jackson Robinson, and still earned a 3 seed. That is a tremendously successful season for Mark Pope and the Kentucky Wildcats, and we'll see if they can make a run in March, starting up against this Troy team, and then potentially after that playing Illinois or the winner of that Texas Xavier game. Kentucky beat up right now. Hard to imagine with their defense that they make a super deep run, but it's been an impressive season for Mark Pope. I wouldn't count him out just yet. Then we got the 7-seeded UCLA Bruins, another familiar face for Gonzaga, and then a Pac-12 foe, a future familiar face for Gonzaga in the Utah State Aggies. That's your 7-10 matchup. Mick Cronin and the Bruins really struggled getting into the Big Ten Conference. Mick blamed it on everything but himself, as he so often does. He blamed his team. He blamed the travel. He blamed all sorts of stuff, but ultimately UCLA just wasn't that good at the end of the year. Still got a 7 seed, though, taking on Utah State, who kind of ran the table in the Mountain West for most of the year, but ultimately stumbled down the stretch. New Mexico ended up winning the regular season. Colorado State ended up winning the conference tournament, but Utah State still earns themselves a comfortable 10 seed and a chance to pull an upset against UCLA, where they'd likely face Tennessee in the second round. Tennessee playing Wofford, a 2-15 matchup there. The Vols in the SEC Tournament Championship, but lost to Florida. Zakai Ziegler, Chaz Lanier, dynamic backcourt for Rick Barnes and the Vols. A team that is very, very comfortably could come out of this region if it's not Houston, if it's not Gonzaga making a tremendous run, or Kentucky. There's a lot of really good teams in this league. But Tennessee, Rick Barnes hasn't had a ton of success deep in the tournament, hasn't gotten this team to a Final Four yet. But I wouldn't be surprised to see this Tennessee team make some real noise for Coach Barnes this year. Let's talk about the rest of the tournament bracket. We're going to talk about what's going on with Randy Bennett and the Gales. Where did they get seeded? What do their matchups look like? Could they make a deep run? Plus some other teams Gonzaga's familiar with. All that and more coming up in just a second. But first, folks, March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. On FanDuel, when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. And with tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to get in on. Gonzaga's opening 6.5-point favorites over the 9-seeded Georgia Bulldogs. If you want to get in on that action, you can bet on region championships. You can bet on the national champion, all sorts of stuff. Visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Today's episode is also brought to you by Varsity Icons. Get ready to bring your favorite Zags to life. VarsityIcons.com delivers the ultimate collection of action figures that honors current and former Zags. Varsity Icons is the premier sports collectible figure for your Gonzaga Bulldogs. And today we highlight everyone's favorite Ben Gregg. Varsity Icons was started by a longtime Gonzaga fan who wanted to create collectible figures of everyone's all-time favorite Zags. The mission of Varsity Icons is to create figures of current and former Zags for everybody to collect and enjoy. And there's no question that Varsity Icons wanted to highlight Ben Gregg to be their first figurine. He's been a fan favorite since joining the Zags way back in 2021. Ben exemplifies what it means to be a Gonzaga Bulldog every time he steps on the court. We are excited to create more of your favorite Zags in the future, so stay tuned and order your Varsity Icons Ben Gregg figure today at varsityicons.com. Varsity Icons, where icons live forever.
The NCAA Tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA Tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Closing out the show, taking a look at some other bracketology notes as we now finally have the field of 68 set here after Selection Sunday. We'll start with the Gales. St. Mary's, Randy Bennett's team, number 7 seed, so one spot higher than Gonzaga, just justifiably so. I think there's a lot of conversation. Maybe Gonzaga and St. Mary's will get the same seed, but St. Mary's probably deserve to have a higher seed than Gonzaga. That happens here. They get a 7 seed. Gonzaga gets an 8 seed. The Gales will take on 10 seed Vanderbilt. Shocker. Another team in the SEC, 2 WCC versus SEC matchups in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And if the Gales win, they're going to take on another SEC team because Alabama is the 2 seed in that region, very likely to advance past the 15 seed. In that case, the Gales would potentially, their path to the Sweet 16 likely goes through 2 teams in the greatest conference, arguably in college basketball history. Starts against Vanderbilt, Mark Byington's club, a team that got completely rebuilt after replacing Jerry Stackhouse this offseason. Byington comes over from James Madison, brings A.J. Hoggard from Michigan State, among a handful of others transfers. And this team's been very, very good throughout the year. Still, I think the Gales should be able to advance past Vanderbilt and a relatively inexperienced head coach. But the Bama matchups was very intriguing. Bama is one of the best offensive teams in the country. They're an electric, lights-out, three-point shooting, fast-paced team, and they're going to go up against a completely different setup at St. Mary's. Obviously, the slow-paced, methodical, highly efficient offense. It's going to be interesting to see how these two teams go about it, and we really wanted to see this matchup last year, but unfortunately, the Gales did not cooperate with that as they lost to a 12-seeded Grand Canyon as a 5 seed, which would have set up an opportunity to play 4-seeded Alabama in the second round in Spokane. Instead, the committee says, let's run it back, give them another opportunity. If St. Mary's can get by Vanderbilt, realistic chance they end up playing the 2-seeded Alabama in the second round. Very excited to see how that might shake out. Cliff Omoruyi versus Mitchell Saxton in the front court, Mark Sears versus Augustus Marcelonis in the backcourt, former Pepperdine Wave Houston Millette coming off the bench for Alabama. A lot of different intrigue in that potential matchup to keep an eye on. Other teams in the same region as St. Mary's that could present interesting matchups if things were to fall in a unique way for this bracket. BYU is a 6 seed in that specific side of the region. So if BYU were to get by the 3 seed, and if obviously St. Mary's were to get by 2-seeded Alabama, you could set up a BYU-St. Mary's matchup, a few former WCC opponents trying to get into the Elite Eight. I don't think it's super likely, although I do think BYU has a chance to make some real noise in this tournament. They've been playing some really great basketball as of late. Igor Demine, their star freshman guard, has been fantastic. Kenan Ketching is another freshman for them. Richie Saunders, their best player, he's been fantastic as well. Fun team to watch, even if it is BYU and Boo. We don't really like rooting for BYU, but they're not in the same conference anymore, so we can root for them, I suppose, now that they're in the Big 12. Other Zag opponents, we already talked about Kentucky and UCLA, both teams that are in Gonzaga's region and that they played earlier in this year. UConn ended up getting an 8 seed, and Baylor ended up getting a 9 seed. Again, a testament to the fact that Gonzaga played these teams expecting them to be top 10 teams. When they played Kentucky, they were a top 5 team. They ended up getting a 3 seed. When they played UCLA, they were a top 25 team. They ended up getting a 7 seed. They played UConn, they were a top 10, top 15 team. They ended up getting an 8 seed. They played Baylor. They were a top 10 team. They ended up getting a 9 seed. San Diego State was not ranked when Gonzaga played them, but they were expected to do better than barely getting in on the bubble. But that's what happened. The San Diego State Aztecs are in the play-in game against North Carolina. The winner of that game will play Ole Miss, the 6th seed. So that's where San Diego State finds themselves. But the big storyline here is 2 teams Gonzaga played this year who did not make the NCAA tournament, West Virginia and Indiana. Both teams were pretty surprising omissions. We're having a few technical difficulties here trying to close out the show, but I'm just going to say here that is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked On Zags. Again, we're going to have a lot more detail about this matchup coming up against Georgia. We're going to have some more detail about the rest of the region, everything going on here as March Madness officially begins. We're going to talk about all of this in the next couple of days here. Also, check out the Bracket Breakdown Show. Amazon, myself, Isaac Shade. We are together right now, hanging out in Dallas after doing all the bracket breakdown stuff for Amazon. If you haven't seen it, there's a teaser in the show. There's also, you can check it on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. Some really fantastic stuff, some really fun guests. We had a lot of fun getting all of this stuff put together for you all. So we'll check it out if you have not done so yet. As always, I want to say go Zags. And no, it wasn't the seed that we all wanted necessarily for Gonzaga, but I still have some confidence this team can at least get a W and maybe give Houston a significant run for their money in the round of 32. We're going to talk about all that in the next couple of days. Thanks again for listening, folks. And of course, as always, go Zags.